Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Novel Approaches, a close readings podcast series from the London Review of Books. I'm Thomas Jones, a senior editor at the paper and your host for this episode on Wuthering Heights. And to talk about money and property, as well as obsession, betrayal, revenge, cruelty, the uncanny, unreliable narrators, weather, music, language, and of course, dogs, in Emily Bronte's novel of 1847, I'm delighted to be joined by Patricia Lockwood and David Trotter. Patricia Lockwood is a contributing editor at the LRB and the author of 2 collections of poetry, a memoir, Pre-Study, and a novel, No One Is Talking About This. Her second novel, Will There Ever Be Another You, will be published later this year. Hello, Patricia, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me to talk about dogs.
And David Trotter is an emeritus professor of English literature at Cambridge, and his books include The Uses of Phobia, essays on literature and film, and Brute Meaning, essays in materialist criticism from Dickens to Hitchcock, several of which were first published in the LRB. Hello, David, and thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here, and I will try and get a cat in there.
Oh, please, yes.
And some rabbits. And camels, but anyway, we'll get to the camels later. But in a recent essay in the LRB on Emily Brontë, David, you wrote, among other things, about her use of the word circumstance in Wuthering Heights and its various meanings, which we'll get to a bit later in our discussion. But to begin, could you talk a little bit about the biographical and historical circumstances in which Wuthering Heights came to be written and published?
Yeah. I don't know quite how far back to go because there is so much of the deep Brontë family history looming over this book. So I don't want to go all the way back to the early years, but I think it is quite interesting to start perhaps with the actual circumstances of the publication of this extraordinary novel, because they were in themselves quite complicated. And I think what happened was that Charlotte Brontë, by then the elder sister, was the real entrepreneur in the Brontë family. And it was she who first persuaded her sisters, her surviving sisters, Emily and Anne, to assemble some of the best of the poems they'd been writing for many years and to prepare them for submission to a publisher. And the publisher they found was a shady figure called Thomas Courtly Newby. And Newby did, in fact, publish poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell, their male pseudonyms, in 1847. But he didn't do a very good job of it. He can't have put a lot of effort into it because the edition sold a grand total of 2 copies.
2 copies, yes.
2 copies.
One gives hope to us all.
It does, absolutely. I know. Anyway, understandably, the sisters decided at that point that they'd better pivot to fiction as a rather more marketable commodity. So by the summer of 1847, there was a package doing the rounds among the London publishers, which contained the manuscripts of Charlotte Bronte's The Professor, Emily's Wuthering Heights, and Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey. And the idea was to publish these all as a 3-volume set, because the 3-decker or the 3-volume set was the approved method of publication for fiction at that time. So that's what they decided to do. But at that point, Newby rejected The Professor, or it may possibly be that Charlotte withdrew it. So Emily extended, or we think that she extended, Wuthering Heights to fill 2 volumes of a 3-volume set, the other volume being, of course, Agnes Grey. And that did finally appear after many more problems in December 1847. And by that time, Charlotte, still writing as Currer Bell, had published Jane Eyre with a much more reputable publisher, Smith, Elder and Company. And that was an immediate bestseller. The first edition of that, 2,500 copies sold out within months. But the end result of this was that by the end of 1847, someone had to break the news to Patrick Brontë that he now had 3 fully fledged authors in the household whose work had already begun to stir controversy in the far-off metropolitan circles in London.
Yeah, so Patrick Brontë, their father, was a Church of England clergyman, the curate in the village of Haworth in West Yorkshire, halfway between Leeds and Manchester. And he'd held that position, so just to fill in a little bit of the earlier family history, he'd held that position since 1820, when Charlotte and Emily were still quite little girls, and Anne was a newborn baby. Charlotte was born in 1816, Emily in 1818, Anne in 1820, and their brother Branwell in 1817. Their mother died of cancer in 1821. Two older sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, both died in childhood in 1825, possibly of typhoid, possibly tuberculosis, either caught at or exacerbated by the deprived conditions at their boarding school, the clergy daughters' school at Cowan Bridge, where Charlotte and Emily were also briefly pupils. I mean, all those experiences were transformed in different ways in their fiction. So in 1847, when their novels were published in the manner that David has just described, the three surviving sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, were in their early 30s or late 20s. They were all unmarried or living together with their father and brother at the parsonage in Haworth, where they had lived nearly all their lives, so they were still, in some senses, outsiders there. They weren't nth generation Yorkshire women. Their father was Irish, their mother was from Cornwall. And their class position, too, wasn't straightforward. They didn't work on the land. They didn't own the land either. And they were educated. They were short of money. And before trying to sell their writing, the sisters had worked as teachers or governesses, including a stint for Charlotte and Emily in the early 1840s in Brussels. But anyway, now it's the end of 1847. Jane Eyre's a bestseller, as you said, David, and the Brontes novels are causing controversy in London. So what was so scandalous about Wuthering Heights in particular?
Well, it was regarded as completely amoral, which seems to me entirely correct.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's pretty much all I'd say about it. I mean, there were lots of adjectives slung about how disagreeable it was. So to say there was a gut reaction, I think, is not entirely metaphoric in this case. And it seems to have been Wuthering Heights in particular that actually provoked this response. I mean, I think on the whole, reviewers and the first readers were very uneasy about Jane Eyre. Agnes Grey was relatively uncontroversial, but it was really Wuthering Heights that drew the most fire because it was and is amoral. That, the whole question of a respectability, the idea of respectable lifestyle, respectable way of living, not interested.
No.
Yeah, totally unrespectable. In a piece for the LRB a few years ago, Patricia, reviewing a reissue of Marion Engel's 1976 novel Bear, you mentioned a letter that Engel wrote in which she speaks of her preference for Emily Brontë over Charlotte, which is easy to suspect, as you put it. And then you wrote, Cathy froths at the mouth and gets down on all fours. She is a creature. And in one of your recent emails when we were talking about what to talk about today, you made this intriguing suggestion that Wuthering Heights takes place in the animal kingdom. What did you mean by that?
I mean, I talked a bit about whether the novel takes place in the animal world, but I think we can narrow it down even further and say that it takes place in the world of dogs. I do believe, like I wrote down at one point, I think we meet when our dogs fight. So it's people aren't even introducing themselves to each other, but first their dogs go at each other almost as their avatars. So it's like it's even more savage than that. It's like, what would a mastiff be if he were a man? Like, that's Heathcliff. He's called so many things in the novel. He's called a cannibal, a goblin. He's multiple times called a goblin. He's called a vampire. But more than anything, he's just like kind of like a dog standing on hind legs.
I think that there's one story that actually confirms your impression, I think, which is about Emily Brontë herself. And when her favourite dog, Keeper, got into a fight with other dogs in the street outside, there's one eyewitness report to this and says that while various other animals who considered themselves men stood around in the street doing absolutely nothing, Emily waded in there and dredged well their noses with pepper. And I love that expression. Dredging well their noses with pepper, and completely broke them up. But I mean, that's actually, that's what she was. I mean, that was her view of the world. It is a kind of amoral place where these sort of battles happen all the time, the kind of fratricidal world, and also dogs fighting all the time. Shit happens, and you have to deal with it. And that's the moral, if there is a moral of the book, that's it. Shit happens, deal with it.
Deal with it. You're right. You talk about consequences. She's not interested in why things happen.
Yes.
Simply the fact that they do.
Yeah. In terms of what kind of shit happens, just to remind listeners in a very broad outline, it's the late 18th century. The Earnshaw family has lived at Wuthering Heights on the West Yorkshire moors for at least 300 years. Catherine Earnshaw and her adoptive brother Heathcliff are inseparable as children, but when she agrees to marry Edgar Linton, the heir to Thrushcross Grange, the other big house in the area, Heathcliff disappears into the night. And 3 years later he returns, having mysteriously made his fortune, and he's determined to wreak his slow revenge on everyone, which he proceeds to do in some very dark and shitty ways.
David, can I ask a question of you as a scholar? So there is this idea that perhaps Emily did embark upon or even get quite far in a second novel, but perhaps Charlotte discovered it and threw it away. Now, to me, that seems insane, because what could possibly be in that lost novel that was worse than what we find in Wuthering Heights, that was more unacceptable? I mean, I think it speaks a great deal to Charlotte's, I don't even know what we would call it, her comprehension or her latitude, that she's like, yeah, I'll let this book go out into the world. So what do we think about that? Is there a hidden second novel that is perhaps even more barbaric than the first?
Well, you're absolutely right. The damage had been done.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't add a
We're
few more
already in the
dogs. Not making
cesspool. I know.
So that's right. That's right. So trouble is, I can't really add anything to that because I can't add to your perhaps.
Right.
I think that's where things stand. Unfortunately, if there was anybody, it would have been Charlotte, because who else? There does seem to be enough evidence to suggest that she was writing something. And to me, it's inconceivable that she wouldn't.
Yeah, I agree with you.
She was such an inventive writer. And that inventiveness was her, really. It was part of her. Surely she would have carried on doing that after the first novel. And all the others were doing it. I mean, Charlotte basically wrote Jane Eyre in the time it took the wretched newbie to actually produce Wuthering Heights.
Yeah.
She wrote a whole new novel.
I took note of that too, and it always strikes me in these accounts of I think Villette, she turned in the third volume of it, and it was written out in 10 days or something like that. It's quite ridiculous to go back in time. You go back in time and you see the absolute speed with which these novels were written. I have this idea of them because, so the 3 novels in 1847 go out in a packet together, right? They go out in this mysterious packet, and it's The Professor, it's Agnes Grey, and it's Wuthering Heights. And we have this really wonderful image of them over that winter and spring, all writing these novels together, reading paragraphs out loud to each other. And the detail that I think the most interesting about the Brontes' composition, all walking endlessly around the dining room table together in the evenings. Now, David, you wrote about the musicality of Wuthering Heights and the music in Nellie Dean, who knows the ballads and knows the superstitions and knows about the fairies. But I think that there is as much of this driving walking in the rhythm of the book as there is music, too.
Do you say a bit more about the walking?
Yes. So do you know this? I have this passage copied out. This is from Juliet Barker's The Brontes. The 3 tales over which the sisters had labored through the winter and spring were The Professor, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey. Returning to the habits of their childhood, the sisters wrote their books in close collaboration, reading passages out loud to each other and discussing the handling of their plots and their characters as they walked round and round the dining room table each evening. And we have this image too. So one imagines Charlotte at the beginning, then Emily, and then Anne bringing up the rear, right? But when Emily gets sick at Branwell's funeral, right? So she keeps walking as long as she can until her strength gives out. She passes away. And then Anne passes away as well. And Charlotte continued to walk around the table to the end of her life, I think. When she was in the evening, she would do that every night.
That question of Emily Bronte's lost second novel, which you brought up earlier, Patricia, is such a fascinating one. Unfortunately, we can only imagine it. Though I suppose one thing that we do have is many, as it were, ghost versions of Wuthering Heights. The novel's had so many different afterlives in film, in music, in readers, and in non-readers' imaginations. Your LRB piece, David, you refer to the moment everyone remembers whether they've read Wuthering Heights or not, and that's Cathy's ghost tapping on the window, asking to be let in. And the ghost that Kate Bush ventriloquizes in her song Wuthering Heights, which I should say I do love that song. But in one of your emails, Patricia, you described the modern post-Kate Bush idea of the novel as a mass hallucination. So there is this, as it were, fever dream romance version of Wuthering Heights in which Cathy and Heathcliff fall in love, they're thwarted, she dies and she's a ghost, and then the end. And that really isn't the story at all, is it?
Right.
So, well, it's only it's part of it, but so much else happens too around that. And when I first read it as a teenager, I was surprised, to put it mildly, by how much else is going on around that. I mean, was surprise a response that either of you had the first time you read it?
I think what surprised me most, and actually reading the book after knowing about its reputation, was the intricacy of the chronology.
Oh my God.
I can barely say that word, and that's symptomatic, really.
Yeah.
So I think we need to perhaps start there. And that Wuthering Heights begins emphatically at a particular time in a particular place. And the novel's first word is in fact a number, 1801. And the story will loop back from 1801 to 1771, which is when Mr. Earnshaw walks the 60 miles from the West Riding of Yorkshire to Liverpool and returns with a small boy bundled up in his arms. And the small boy, of course, is Heathcliff. And the plot then makes its way forward from 1771 to 1801, and then a little bit further to 1803, the January 1803. So that's quite a long span of time. And there are lots of intricate workings of cogs to get from one end of that span to the other. And the small boy's Heathcliff, and 1801, he's the owner of two substantial properties, which I think we do need to mention. It is place as well as time. Two substantial properties, Wuthering Heights up on the bleak windswept moors, and Thrushcross Grange down in the valley below, which he has rented for a year to Mr. Lockwood, a dilettante, a wealthy dilettante. And the book is basically about the far-reaching consequences of that original journey to Liverpool for 3 generations of the inhabitants of the two houses. And I will try now to recapitulate those 3 generations. You may have to help me out here and there. So there are the original owners, Mr. Earnshaw and Mr. Linton, their children, Catherine and Hindley Earnshaw, and Edgar and Isabella Linton, with the orphaned Heathcliff somewhere in the mix, and their children's children, Hareton Earnshaw, Catherine Linton, and Linton Heathcliff. And by the time we got to Linton Heathcliff, the supply of proper names has run out.
It's given out.
Altogether.
It's completely given out.
I mean, what next? Linton.
Linton. I actually reread it maybe about 6 months ago, and I just wrote in my notebook, the #1 book in the world about a nest of Yorkshire vipers who all have the same name. They literally all have the same name. At any given point, they change names with each other, or they change places, stations in life. Suddenly you'll end up at Thrushcross Grange. Suddenly you'll end up at Wuthering Heights. It's amazing. Thinking about reading it as a teenager and being like, of course I couldn't keep track of anything. Like, that wasn't just necessarily my problem or my experience of the book.
So I still have a little scrap of notepaper that I found tucked into the novel on this last rereading, which I made a little family tree to help me keep track of who was who.
Wait, from the past? From when you were a teen?
No, not that long ago. I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years ago. I mean, my grandmother would read Wuthering Heights every year to reward herself for getting through Christmas, but it's more like once a decade for me. Anyway, on my little Wuthering Heights family tree here, we've got the Earnshaws at Wuthering Heights and their children, Hindley and Catherine, and the Lintons at Thrushcross Grange and their children, Edgar and Isabella. And then Hindley marries a woman called Frances, and there's this weird bit that no one quite knows where he found her. And they have a son, Hareton, and Catherine marries Edgar, and they have a daughter, also called Catherine. Isabella marries Heathcliff, and they have a son called Linton, who marries young Cathy. The older generation all die, so gradually to most of the next generation. It's sort of a spoiler, but not really. First Frances, then Catherine, then Hindley, then Isabella, then Edgar. Everyone apart from Heathcliff. And then young Linton dies. And at this point, we've got the family or the household at Wuthering Heights as Lockwood first encounters it, which is Heathcliff, Hareton, and Cathy. And I mean, I suppose one of the things about all those deaths, which seem so awful, but that was the experience of the Brontes themselves, that their mother died and their sisters died, and this everyone dying was. And as she was writing the book, in fact, Emily Brontë was dying herself, and she would be dead within a year of it being published. So this Gothic, apparently, sequence of deaths is true to Emily Bronte's experience.
Although sometimes you're like, come on, Heathcliff, just nut up a little bit. Or Cathy, why are you behaving that way? Her behavior, as in the younger version of her, makes absolutely no sense. I've thought about that a lot, too, as a woman. Was that how Emily saw like females behaving, and sort of thought that it was sort of purposeless and reasonless, and that she saw no particular logic behind what people did, and it went into the novels that way? Or are they, elemental? Are they caprice itself, fickleness? Because Cathy is both, unchanging, eternal, and totally fickle, willing to about face in a single moment, betray you, go off to the Lintons, get attacked by their dog, and then end up coming home and like making fun of you for not being able to read, right? So like, what are these personalities we're dealing with here?
So Heathcliff is brought home by Mr. Earnshaw and is brought up sort of as one of the family, but not really one of the family. But Mr. Earnshaw seems to favour him over his own son, Hindley. And Catherine and Heathcliff are very close, and they're out on the moors running around barefoot whenever they can. And one day they go and peer through the window at Thrushcross Grange, where the Lintons' dog, who I think... Is he called Throttler or something?
I don't know. I didn't mark that.
Or Skulker. No, he's called Skulker, I think.
Skulker?
Yeah,
what a name.
Skulker, the Linton's dog.
Skulker Linton.
Skulker Linton. Skulker then bites Catherine.
Yes, of
course. So she has to then, it's brought into the house and has to be looked after because, if your dogs bite your neighbour's children, you have to, take them in and bandage them up.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, it is really confusing, and it's meant to be confusing because Lockwood, who I think I mentioned earlier without explaining who he is, Lockwood, who interestingly, like Heathcliff, only has the one name that we know of. Lockwood is the primary narrator, and he's a kind of stand-in for the reader because he's confused, we're confused, and he's our entry into this strange and confusing world. So perhaps we should have a reading now that illustrates that confusion.
Yeah, I'll set the scene because this is Lockwood's second visit to Wuthering Heights in a determined attempt to get to know his landlord, Heathcliff. And at this point, Heathcliff is actually outside. He's in the fold looking after his sheep. So Lockwood is entertained instead, if that's the right word, in a warm, cheerful apartment by some far from warm and cheerful folk. There's a young woman whom he mistakes for Mrs. Heathcliff, but is in fact Heathcliff's daughter-in-law, Catherine Linton, and a young man who will turn out to be Hareton Earnshaw and Juno the dog, who had attacked him on his first visit. So there we go. It glowed delightfully in the radiance of an immense fire, compounded of coal, peat and wood. And near the table, laid for a plentiful evening meal, I was pleased to observe the Missus, an individual whose existence I had previously never suspected. I bowed and waited, thinking she would bid me take a seat. She looked at me, leaning back in her chair, and remained motionless and mute. "Rough weather," I remarked. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Heathcliff, the floor must bear the consequences of your servants' leisure attendance. I had hard work to make them hear me." She never opened her mouth. I stared. She stared also. At any rate, she kept her eyes on me in a cool, regardless manner, exceedingly embarrassing and disagreeable. "Sit down," said the young man gruffly. "He'll be in soon." I obeyed, and hemmed, and called the villain Juno, who deigned at this second interview to move the extreme tip of her tail in token of owning my acquaintance. "A beautiful animal," I commenced again. "Do you intend parting with the little ones, madam?" "They are not mine," said the amiable hostess, more repellingly than Heathcliff himself could have replied. "Ah, your favourites are among these," I continued, turning to an obscure cushion full of something like cats. "A strange choice of favourites," she observed scornfully. Unluckily, it was a heap of dead rabbits. I hemmed once more and drew closer to the hearth, repeating my comments on the wildness of the evening. "You should not have come out," she said.
That was very well done. It was very scary when you were Cathy. Can I ask a practical question?
Yeah.
Okay. Why does Heathcliff want a tenant at all?
Oh well, he is said to be at some point. He's very tight, isn't he? He wants,
Avaricious.
he wants to earn the money. He collects all his rents from all his tenant farmers, and he doesn't spend money he doesn't want to. I mean, he is acquisitive.
Yeah.
So he doesn't want to have an empty house, and here's someone who'll pay him rent. Also, the novel needs a narrator, but that's
more my thought. This is more my thinking. So, of course, I paid a lot of attention to Lockwood, when I first read it in high school, because he had my name. But also, I found him very, very funny. I think even his second line is something like, "My, this is certainly a beautiful country!" ! And it just very much underlines what we're about to experience in contrast with his disposition, his tendency towards self-regard, self-delusion, his feeling that he better be careful that Cathy not regret her choice, because he himself is so handsome and she might fall in love with him. So I really liked that. I like this entrance into the world being kind of just like this pompous guy, which again, David read very properly and very well.
Yeah, I mean, he does. He says it is a beautiful country, and he describes it as a perfect misanthropist's heaven, because he fancies himself as a misanthropist, but he has no idea what misanthropy is.
He doesn't. No. Like, you think you like dogs? You'll meet some people who like dogs here.
Can I just go back to Tom's point that Tom made really in passing, which is about Lockwood being a kind of bridge with the reader, and particularly, I think, with the metropolitan reader.
And the southern reader, yeah.
A southern reader, yeah, exactly, a southern reader. And another way to put that would be to say that he was a recognisable fictional figure, because he was modelled to some extent on the narrators of Sir Walter Scott's Waverley
Yes, the
novels.
Waverley novels.
Kind of honourable but rather dozy young Englishmen who undertake expeditions into the wild country north of the border. And these young men actually have a quality which is rather useful to an author, which is that they turn out to possess a perfectly, a combative streak. They turn out to possess a combative streak that is actually perfectly calculated to put the locals on their mettle by rubbing them up the wrong way. And it's that rubbing up the wrong way that I think that Lockwood does so perfectly in this particular occasion.
Absolutely.
And his bull in a china shop performance stirs up the mud at the bottom of the pond in an absolutely remarkable way. It brings the whole kind of distinctive Wuthering Heights atmosphere alive.
Yes, I totally agree. Yes. So he's in there, and it's his observance of the city proprieties and his little thing like, "Are you going to offer me tea? Have you offered me tea already?" Like this whole thing. Of course it's going to rub them up. And I think that it serves perfectly to show us that entrance into the world. But also he gets in this situation, and his whole quality too is that he never has any idea what the hell is going on, right? But no one would have any idea what was going on at Wuthering Heights. It's absolute chaos. So it's perfect. And he identifies with the characters of the story that Nellie Dean eventually tells, and we sort of identify with him and enter the novel that way.
Yeah. I mean, he has this phenomenal sense of entitlement, I guess, doesn't he?
Absolutely. Yes, he does.
But can we just say something about what it is that his sense of entitlement stirs up? Because I think that's as much as the interest, really, in the particular scene we've just been looking at. Because, I mean, it seems to be in a way that what this scene demonstrates is that this is a novel as much about environment and atmosphere as it is a novel about personalities.
Yes.
And what's in the foreground in most novels, what people do and what they say and so on, is in this particular scene indistinguishable from background. And it's that intermingling of background and foreground that seems to be very characteristic in a way of the novel as a whole. So in that scene, neither Cathy nor Hareton has yet been identified properly.
Right.
They will both emerge in due course as personalities in their own right, and indeed 300 pages later they will marry each other. So they will emerge, but at this point, the time being, they simply kind of recede into their surroundings. They become literally part of the furniture. I was thinking of the line about Cathy. She looked at me leaning back in her chair and remained motionless and mute. And I like the way that the very terseness of their responses embeds them ever more deeply in the kind of uniformly hostile Wuthering Heights atmosphere. So like Lockwood, we turn our attention instead to what would normally be mere background, like the dog Juno, who acknowledges him by the waving the tip of her tail. And I want to ask the question, is that really what dogs do? Because I mean, my cat I know, is forever signalling to me by waving the tip of her tail. But I thought that was a cat thing to do.
That's
What
so
about
interesting.
dogs?
I think that they do lift up the little point of it. I'm glad to know that we're all cat people here. Mine is rumpusing around over there. But yes, you're quite right. When the tip of their tail, a cat's tail, forms like a little question mark, then they're happy and they're flirting with you and leading you on. But yeah, I think that dogs do a little something like that too, just like that kink in the tip of the tail. Yeah.
Maybe.
I mean,
Okay.
as much as furniture, she could also be, you know, one of the liver spotted litter, right? Like they may as
Yes.
well be animals, right? And there's this
Yeah,
whole idea
exactly.
he arrives in out of this weather, but there's weather inside too. It's so much a novel of weather. Weather is perhaps moving through the people in such a way as to cause them to move things. It doesn't have motive, you know, it like flaps things in the breeze, right? So is that why these people are acting this way? Because they're part of the landscape, because they can be bowed down by these things, twisted by these things, deprived in these environments.
To listen to the rest of this episode of Novel Approaches, the full unexpurgated version, and all the other LRB Close Reading series, go to lrb.me/close readings or follow the link in the description.